would happen at the end of the day. And he said that Africa needs what? We need to empower and salvage our minds as Africans. We must empower and salvage our minds, and then Africa will be developed. And he also made mention of this event, that is the African Liberation Day, and one of the activities that blacks actually celebrated in United States that I couldn't capture, that those events or those commemorations will remain a date until we realize ourselves as Africans. So thank you so much, Mr. Njai. And there will be a question and answer section where myself and the participants will have the opportunity to pose some questions to Njai. So on that note, I would now have the pleasure to call on Mr. or Dr. Umar Johnson to make his remark. I don't know whether he is set now.
Yes, sir. I am prepared to go forward. Can you hear me?
Thank you. I can hear you.
Okay. First, I want to say great comments from the previous brother. Okay. Everyone's microphone is muted there. All right. Great comments from the brother who just spoke. And I am going to start off by saying the crisis of Pan-Africanism and the crisis of African independence and liberation is the fact that our leadership is not a leadership that serves the best interests of African people. Half century after the independence struggle, the leadership of Africa still serves the agenda of the colonizer. Africa has gotten a flag and anthem independence, but Africa has not received a political and economic independence. And when we speak of the condition of the mother continent, we have to be clear that her condition reflects equally upon the condition of all Africans throughout the diaspora. As Africa goes, so goes the rest of us. One of the contradictions of the African American struggle up until this point has been the fact that our struggle here in America has been divorced from the international African struggle for freedom, liberation, and independence. So one of the reasons why we in the West must pay attention to what happens on the mother continent is because we are affected whether we like it or not. As Africa goes, so goes Africa's children. Now, when we look closely at this issue of leadership, we find that many of Africa's leaders post-independence, more than 60 years now in many cases, were trained in the West, financed by the West, have a Western consciousness. And I would argue that Africa, and I say that in the pluralistic sense, meaning all of us, but in particularly the mother continent, Africa is as much to blame for our situation as are the colonizers, because we have encouraged insincere leadership and we have created a narrative that suggests that the best leaders in Africa are those that are educated in the West. That is a mindset. When I travel throughout the continent, I learn and I see that many of the leaders on the continent send their children to Western-run institutions. The presidents of Africa don't have their children in African schools. They have them in European Christian schools, European Catholic schools, not in African schools. We also have to recognize that many of our leaders in Africa do not emulate the type of behavior that we would like to see from our people on the grassroots level. They buy European goods. They shop in Paris. They shop in London. They shop in America. How can there be a renaissance of the African consciousness when there has not been a renaissance in the consciousness of the African leader. Still further, I think that Africa has swallowed the Western Kool-Aid that suggests being able to vote for somebody means you are free. Well, Africa needs to study the African American and our history, because we have also been taught that having the right to vote means that you are free. But if you look at the 154 years since the so-called African American has gotten his alleged freedom, we are just as oppressed, just as disorganized, just as disenfranchised today as we were when the 13th Amendment was ratified to the United States Constitution. Voting has not changed anything for Black America, and I can promise you, we can have this conversation 500 years from now. Africa will not be better because its citizens can vote. Voting is not the priority. Democracy is not the priority. Development and opportunity is the priority. Let me say it again. Voting is not the priority. Democracy is not the priority. Development and opportunity is the priority. The reason why the West loves democracy is because in a democracy, you can manipulate the elections. In a democracy, whoever controls the media wins most of the time. In a democracy, you give people a false sense of control over their destiny when in fact they have none. So if you don't deal with this issue of leadership, the African leadership crisis, the African American leadership crisis, the African British, the African Caribbean leadership crisis, it's going to be difficult to bring about a revolution or a resurrection of African consciousness and liberation. And let me also say this. The African leader, and there are exceptions, there are always exceptions, but the African leader on the continent, the African leader in America, the African leader in the UK, the Caribbean, Central South America, they are more lazy than they are coward. It is an issue of laziness more than it is an issue of cowardice. Now, cowardice is a big part of this. No one is interested in being assassinated. I understand that. But before you even get to the cowardice, you have to deal with the laziness. The reason why Africa is so enslaved to the West is because its leaders are so lazy and interested in the easiest way out. Very few African leaders are looking for solutions. Most of them are looking for band-aids. No one is trying to solve the problem. They just want to decorate the problem while they are in office long enough to fulfill their terms before they get out of office. Most African leaders spend their time in office preparing their economic future, not the destiny of their nation, but their personal economic futures. People don't get elected to help others. They get elected to help themselves. That is a global reality, irrespective of race. Very few African politicians historically have served the interests of African people, and it's sad. And the reason why it's so sad is because of after all the bloodshed of the 50s and all the bloodshed of the 60s, after all of the loss of life during the African independence struggles, I am afraid and I am certain that Africa will have to undergo a second independence revolution. Not only will this be an independence revolution to finally throw off the yoke of Western domination, but you have to also now fight for independence from your black bourgeoisie. You now have to fight for independence from the conduit. The African leader is the conduit between white supremacy and black oppression on the continent. Why is a country that can grow tea importing tea from the West? Why is a country like Senegal, rich in salt, importing salt? If you have the ability to raise your own chicken, why are you importing chicken from China? The answer is real simple. One of the first things that the European colonizers did when they came into Africa was they disrupted and destroyed traditional African economic systems. You cannot make a people slaves in their own land unless you destroy traditional African economic systems. And so they destroyed the networks of commerce. They destroyed the networks of trade, and they took over the major commodities. The reason Africa is importing things that Africa grows or that Africa can make is because most African nations have signed off on those International Monetary Fund loans. They have signed off on those World Bank loans. And when you accept those IMF and World Bank loans, there's 3 conditions that come with it. And when I speak at the universities here in America, the young Pan-Africanist students always ask the question, Dr. Umar, if Africa is so minerally rich, why are its people in such a devastating political and economic position? The answer is simple. In order to get loans to rebuild your country, you have to accept certain requirements. Requirement number 1, structural adjustment programs and recommendations. When you accept a loan, the African nation they are required to operate a free economy. You know what that means? That means if Senegal has its own salt and Senegal doesn't want to import salt from any Western power, they don't want Morton salt, they don't want nobody else's salt being shipped into Senegal because Senegal has its own salt. So Senegal is going to run its own state-owned salt industry. We don't need anybody else's salt. We have our own. But the United States will tell the president of Senegal, if you want this $5 million loan, you cannot protect your salt market. You have to operate a free economy. This is what they mean when they say free trade. Free trade means you cannot protect the industries in your own country that are keeping your people eating and keeping them employed. There can be no protection. Free trade. Anybody can come in and compete with your own homegrown indigenous markets. That's why African countries that grow tea can't even sell it anymore, because they can't compete. The Western tea companies, the Western salt companies can come in and undersell you. They can produce it faster. They can ship it out quicker. And so now you're competing with foreigners and you cannot compete against them. You're going to lose. Structural adjustment program number 2 is the interest that you must pay on the loan. The more loans that Africa takes out, the worse off Africa will become. The more loans that Africa takes out, the worse off Africa will become. The loan is the new word for colonialism. Foreign investment is the new word for colonialism. They don't use old words anymore. They use good sounding words. They don't say we're going to recolonize Senegal. We're going to recolonize the Gambia. We're going to recolonize Nigeria. They don't say that word anymore. They say we're going to invest in Senegal. We're going to invest in Gambia. We're going to invest in Nigeria. And it is nothing more but a neo-colonialist front. And why? Because it is so much easier as an African leader to take the loan because you don't have to pay back the interest. The nation has to pay back the interest. Every African leader that goes in office will accrue a certain amount of foreign debt, but none of them are obligated to pay it back. It is the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have to bear the economic brunt of poor decisions of Western trained leaders. Number 3, population control. Population control. Now, when you accept loans from the West, particularly in the post-Barack Obama era, Any African nation or Caribbean nation or Central or South American African nation that accepts loans from IMF and World Bank today. And by the way, IMF and World Bank are both based in Washington, D.C. They are American functionary organizations. You accept that money now, you have to implement population control strategies, which include what? Homosexuality, education, and propaganda. You have to accept what? Hysterectomies, sterilization, Planned Parenthood international involvement in your country's affairs, Rockefeller World Population Council involvement in your country's affair, birth control, what they call family planning. The Rockefeller World Population Council has a budget of over $74 million. Planned Parenthood International, hundreds of millions of dollars that they use going into Africa to convince black women that since you are poor, you should not be having children. And let us be clear, post-COVID Africa, post-COVID, what is COVID? A biological weapon. What is AIDS? A biological weapon. What was Ebola? A biological weapon. West Nile virus? A biological weapon. Do your research on the United States Army Biological Weapons Lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. This is where most of these diseases were engineered and manufactured. Not outright created, but manipulated from naturally occurring diseases. Is it a coincidence that the U.S. Army Biological Weapons Lab shut down last year, 2019, out of nowhere? Is that a coincidence that they closed operations in 2019 and we get a COVID pandemic in 2020? Is that a coincidence? Of course not. There are no coincidences when it comes to politics. They shut down operations to hide their involvement in this pandemic. And let me give you 3 reasons why this happened and why it happened now. Reason number 1, according to Rockefeller World Population Council projections and United Nations projections, the elderly will surpass the youth as the most populated age group in the world in the next 30 years. Africa has the oldest living people in the world. Africa will also give birth to the oldest population in the world over the next 30 years. That is a problem for capitalism. And the reason it is a problem for capitalism is because you are only good to capitalism if you can work or if you can purchase. If you cannot work and you cannot purchase, you are no good to capitalism. Capitalism needs people who can produce, and capitalism needs people who can consume. Elders are no longer able to produce, not to the level that capitalism wants them to. And elders are not necessarily interested in consuming because they are at an age where they don't necessarily need much and are not able to purchase much. So from a narrow-minded, selfish, capitalist perspective, old people are bad for business. If you wonder why Italy has been hit so hard, although it is a white country, the reason Italy was hit so hard is because Italy has one of the oldest populations in the world. Italy has one of the oldest populations in the world. And it is a population that was given a flu vaccination just a couple years ago. Part of this COVID is also to cover up the side effects of vaccinations that Bill Gates, the Rockefeller World Population Council, the United Nations has been pushing out around the world. My biggest concern for Africa post-COVID is the medical state of Africa. The medical state of Africa. A couple of days ago, the president of Ghana signed off. A couple of days ago, the president of Ghana signed off on Bill Gates's vaccination protocol. Why would the president of such a progressive pan-Africanist nation such as Ghana sign off on the vaccination protocol? He is now beholden to the Western powers to make sure that almost every citizen in Ghana is given Bill Gates chemicals of death. And let us be clear. These vaccinations that they're pushing in Africa are not helping anybody live longer. African people don't need Western vaccinations in order to live longer. You all know this. You're in Africa. It is not uncommon to walk into a village and find a group of women or men who are beyond the age of 100, still living, breathing, talking, and walking. We don't need vaccinations. We need better diet, and we need a better quality of life. Just as dangerous as vaccinations is stress. The stress from not knowing if your children are going to be properly educated. The stress of not knowing if you'll be able to pay bills. The stress of not knowing if you can take care of your family. Stress kills you just as quickly as poor health care can. Moving on, and then I want to conclude because I don't want to go past my time. We have to recognize that African people globally have been psychologically defeated. If we do not accept this psychological reality, it will be difficult to solve our problems. Speaking as a psychologist, you have to admit you have a problem before you can solve it. And African people globally, we are in denial about our psychological state. Despite how much we say we love Africa, despite how much we claim to be Pan-Africanists, despite how much we claim to love our black skin and our nappy hair, look at our behavior. Our behavior is not consistent with the people that loves themselves. You cannot tell me you love being an African woman, but your hair is not natural, or your hair is in a European hair color. You can't tell me you love being an African man, but your wife does not look like your mother, or your wife is from another race. How do you explain that contradiction? How do you justify that contradiction? We're not fooling nobody but ourselves. We have been psychologically defeated. The average African in the world does not believe we can overcome oppression. Although patience is a virtue, it is not a virtue when it comes to oppression. Patience is not a virtue when it comes to oppression. What do I mean by this? Psychologically speaking, the longer a people are under oppression, the greater their belief will become in that oppression. The longer a people are under oppression, the greater will be their confidence in that oppression. We cannot be patient with oppression because in doing so, every subsequent generation of African children around the world will believe even more so than their parents that we cannot come out from under the oppression. African Liberation Day is today, but we have to liberate the African mind or you will liberate nothing else. There can be no economic revolution in Africa. There can be no political revolution in Africa. There can be no spiritual revolution in Africa. There can be no intellectual revolution in Africa or throughout the diaspora until there is first a psychological revolution. You must change the consciousness of the African. If you do not change his consciousness, you change nothing else. And what are the first two steps to transforming consciousness? And I'll end on this point. Education and economics. Whoever controls the education and controls the economics controls the destiny of that people. I don't care what color they are. I don't care in what era they live. I don't care what flag they pledge allegiance to. I don't care what race, ethnicity, or nationality. Who controls the education of the children and who controls the economics controls the destiny of that people. Clearly, the economics of African people are in the hands of non-Africans. That's not only true in Africa. It is true everywhere in the world. I've spoken on every continent except Australia. Every continent except Australia and throughout the Caribbean. I have never seen yet in my life an economy that is controlled by black folks, even when we are in the numerical majority. How do you explain that? I don't care if you're in Jamaica. I don't care if you're in Suriname, Toronto, London, New York City. I don't care if you're in Accra. I don't care if you're in Ethiopia. Go anywhere in the African world. Even when we are in the majority, Our economy is in the hands of other people. Most African currency is backed by a European bank. Most African currency is created in a European bank. How in the hell can there ever be economic liberation when the same people who colonized you, the same people who colonized us, are printing our money and insuring our money? I read an article when I was in Paris last. Where the president of France had told the Francophone African colonies that they were only going to print a certain amount of money. We're only going to make a certain amount of currency for your country to use. How do you let another country who you claim you have independence from dictate how much of your own money you can have? Let me say this piece. Economics is more about psychology. It looks like I went out there. Am I still there? I'm not sure what happened. Am I still there, family?
I can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me, so I will continue. Economics is as much about psychology as it is about taking care of one's family. Economics is psychological. When an African child in the Congo, or an African child in Lesotho, or an African child in Gabon, or an African child in Eritrea, or an African child in Philadelphia or South Carolina or London or Birmingham or Luton or Wolverhampton or Jamaica or Cuba or Haiti, wherever we are, if an African child has to go outside of his community to find a job, if an African child has to go and beg another race for a job, I can guarantee you that that is not an African child who's going to put much respect on loyalty to his community. If we want African people to be loyal, we must give them something to be loyal for. It is not enough to teach our great African history. It is not enough to beat the drum and wear the dashiki. It is not enough to teach African languages. It is not enough to teach about the great kings and queens of Nile culture. It's not enough. You cannot win a war that you're fighting today by constantly running back to the past to escape your present. I want to say that again. If we believe we're going to keep the loyalty of our children by escaping the present to run back 5,000 years ago to teach them how great we are, we're going to lose. In fact, the European and the Chinese will give you the pass if that's all you want. If the only thing black people want in this world is to be recognized for being the originators of civilization, they will give you that. Because the white man says, I own the present. If the black man wants the past, go ahead and take it. I own the present. And the Chinese man is saying, I own the future. So if the white man owns the present and the black man owns the past and the Chinese owns the future, where does that leave us? Speaking of China, it is absolutely disrespectful to all of those who fought those bloody wars for independence, for African leaders to be turning towards China and now selling out the best interests of African nations to the Chinese. Do you really think the Chinese will be a better colonizer than the European? Do you really think the Chinese will be more benevolent to black people than the Europeans were? Of course they won't. It's no coincidence that the Chinese are bringing their militaries with them when they come to Africa. Why is a sovereign, so-called independent African nation allowing Chinese businesses to bring their own militaries with them? You don't bring a military into my country, but the Chinese are bringing their militaries with them into Africa. What's going to happen? What is going to happen in Africa when the Chinese conduct their first coup? What's going to happen in Africa when the Chinese overthrow the first president of Africa? Because it's coming. Oh, it's coming. It's a part of colonialism. A part of colonialism is selecting the leadership who is most conducive to your foreign agenda. It is a matter of time before the Chinese conduct their first overthrow of an African president. What are we going to do then? What are we going to do then? What are we going to do then? My enemy's enemy is not my friend. My enemy's enemy has never been my friend. We have to wake up. We have to politically educate our African youth, brothers and sisters. We have to stop taking loans from the World Bank, stop taking loans from the IMF. And let me say this. Let me say this. Until African language, indigenous African language, becomes the primary medium of instruction in every African nation, African people will never be free. Let me say it again. In almost every African nation on the continent and in the Caribbean and in Central and South America, the colonizer's language is still the medium of instruction. You go to an Anglophone country, English is still the medium of instruction. You go to a Francophone country, France is still the medium of instruction. Why are we claiming to be free when our children are still being taught through the language of the colonizer? We need a United States of Africa that is more than a flag, more than a symbol, more than a meeting, more than a building. We need a meaningful and progressive United States of Africa that has the ability to veto the decisions that are made by independent African parliaments that are not in the best interests of our people. I close with a quote from the Most Honorable Marcus Garvey. Who said, "Without confidence in yourself, you are twice defeated in the race of life." Without confidence in yourself, you are twice defeated in the race of life, but with confidence you have won even before you have started. And one last point, just one last point. The greatest contradiction of Pan-African nationalism globally, the greatest contradiction of revolutionary Pan-African nationalism globally, is that most of us are still more loyal to our tribes than we are to the African family. That's right. In Black America, we're more loyal to our religions and our fraternal organizations and our petty political organizations than we are to the African family. In Africa, being the part of a tribe is more loyal, more important to many of our people than being a part of the African family. Until the Zulu and the Xhosa eliminate petty differences, nothing changes. Until the Wolof or the Mandingo eliminate petty differences, nothing changes. And I'm only using them as an example, not to say that they necessarily have conflict. But when I travel through the continent, I see the tribalism, I feel the tribalism, and one of the greatest weapons used by African leaders is to do what? Instigate tribalism at election time to stay in office. In Africa, people are not voting for the best person. They're voting for the person who belongs to their tribe, whether or not that person has an agenda for the people. Those are my words. Black power. Your voice is very low, my brother. Your voice is very low.
Yeah, I'm really having issues here with my computer. They just misbehaving. I don't really know what's going on.
Okay. You're clear, but you're low. Your voice is relatively clear, but it's so low I can hardly hear it. I don't know if you can turn the volume up.
I am very, very sorry for that. I will try to speak as loud as possible.
Okay.
And I would say I am very, very sorry. I was supposed to read your biography before you started.
No worries. No worries on the bio. That's not important. Biography is not important.
Now, if Madam Abdullah is said,
you don't have to read. You don't have to read mine too. So because we all, it's It's almost over an hour, so don't worry about the biography.
Okay, you can start.
Well, I must say, first, I'm really inspired listening to the two gentlemen. And first, Nyangai, an economist, and Umar, I've actually been following some of these. There's one that he did, I think he was doing an interview where he was speaking about the relationship between Africa and the Chinese, and he mentioned that briefly. That was the first time that I listened to him. And I must admit, one of his statements really touched me when he said, if we really want to liberate ourselves, for instance, an African woman should use our own hair. And I feel guilty about that. And I feel like putting my hair in a bun. I understand, but what happened actually is how the week that we started messed up all our hair. And you're right, if we started with our own natural hair, we would not be able to, we would not have to do all of it. But yes, I'm going to speak about COVID-19, and then later on, when we will